Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is a T-34 of the Soviet Army from World War II. These little things were revolutionary. Design elements of these would show up even in the Panther, and there is an argument to be made that these were a massive contributing factor to success in the East. So they're a pretty iconic little tank, definitely worth having one in your Soviet Army. Now, the painting method is incredibly simple. It's something that you've probably seen on the channel a couple of times before, but today I'm going to show you with one or two different colors and some different options so you can mix things up if you fancy. As always, all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, so nice and quick, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do, before we even get to priming, is to apply our mud and muck. So first off, pop off the turret, because we're not going to need it. Then grab yourself a scraggly old brush. The more janked up and messy, the better. Just add a wee tiny bit of water, get it wet, and dip it into some PVA glue. So if you're in the States, this is probably Armour's wood glue, anything like that. Now, we're using the bare plastic here because when we jab this onto the surface, you see we get this random beading pattern. Okay, it's never completely covered by the PVA. If you want to thin this out a little bit more, make the beading effect more pronounced, you can do that. It's a good idea, particularly up under the tracks here. So what I'll do is start from the front, and I want to concentrate on areas where mud and stuff is going to collect. So just dabbing this into recesses, splat or two there. And then while that's still wet, that might be a little bit much, grab yourself some baking soda. Now this I'm just going to sprinkle on. Does not need to be careful at all. You can chuck it straight out of the pack if you want to. Now, because the PVA won't have covered perfectly, when we knock this away, what happens is we get this cool random effect to where it actually settles. While this is still wet, it's going to cling a little more tightly than it will do later. But what I'm going to do is to go ahead, maybe thin that down a little more. I'll jam that up under the tracks. Just a quick blast of this under here as well. Just think of anywhere that mud will collect and you can have some fun splurging this in. So once that's done, that's wet, along comes our baking soda. Now you want to give that plenty of time to dry. It really needs to be rock solid before you continue. So either pop it up on a radiator or leave it somewhere overnight. The upshot is, once it is dry, you've got stuff there which is basically concrete. That's not coming off. So what you can do is grab yourself another raggedy old brush, bigger the better, and we'll just flick away the excess. You can also just go ahead and prime it with the excess still attached to it. You'll get a slightly funky texture. But now, this is ready to take outside and prime. Now I've gone ahead and I have primed this with Russian uniform from Vallejo. Now you can use any army green, it will work perfectly well. If you've seen me paint tanks on the channel before, particularly historical ones, you'll have seen Russian uniform a few times because it is such a useful base color for most of the allied green vehicles that are out there. Now the difference is mostly in how you shade them. And what I've got here to start that off with, this is half and half Grimdark Shadow and Speedpaint Medium from the Army Painter. Now Grimdark Shadow, that is one from the Blanche sets, and it is a black-green. If you wanted to, you could just go ahead here and shade with dark tone. It won't matter too much, but you'll see ordinarily I will shade this green with a brownish wash or something instead. What I'm doing here is making this a little darker and sort of reinforcing the green with the green that is in that Grimdark Shadow. So I want to make sure I go over everything. Make sure that you're getting it around all the little bits and pieces. And yeah, don't worry too much if it does pool a little bit in some flat areas. Shift it around with your brush as best you can to try and prevent that, but it's not the end of the world if it does happen. And of course, anything that we do to the hull, we will also be doing to the turret. Now once it has had plenty of time to dry, you'll have something that looks like this. It's a little bit shiny in the recesses on the wheel wells because I probably overdid it there, but on the tank itself, that's fine. I have got one or two tide marks. I'm not terribly concerned about that because we're going to fix that now. Now on my palette over here, what you can see is I've put on 2 parts of Russian uniform and then 1 part of khaki. And what you use to mix here can quite significantly change up the color of your tank. So have a think about if you want to lean into a slightly more dusty, dry, greenish gray, or do you want more of a yellowy finish, in which case something like Middlestone might be a good mixed color. Anyhow, I need to grab myself a dry brush, and I've got here, this is one of the Army Painter Masterclass brushes, pretty handy for this. Just work a little bit of it into your bristles, and then little circular motions, start scrubbing it along the larger, flatter areas. Now, even though the khaki will look quite extreme, on the palette, once it's actually on the miniature and dried a little, you'll see it's not as heavy as you'd think. So, little circular scrubbing motions, and anywhere that you do end up with those tide marks still visible, what you can do is just stipple over them a couple of times again to hide those. So, I'm going to go over the entire tank, and like before, don't forget you've got a turret. Then what you can do is add just a tiny wee bit of extra khaki into your mix to lighten it up a bit further. And then using a smaller brush, what you want to do is just buff in along some of the flat panels and towards the edges, just to add a little bit of texture and make some of those flatter panels look a little bit more worn. Now, if we had an airbrush out, we'd probably look at this as color modulation. But with our little dry brush, this is just as easy. Just little circular motions, and you don't want to add too much, otherwise it's going to make the tank look, well, a different color entirely. But 1 or 2 little smidgens, concentrating on big flat areas, and particularly the top of the tank, you'll add quite a bit of visual interest here. Now with the turret in place, hopefully that makes it a little clearer what we're doing with that color modulation. So I'm going to pop this off again, and in order to finish off our highlighting, what I've got is an old makeup brush. Anything big and slightly flat-edged will be useful here, and a bit of khaki. What I want to do this time is concentrate, funnily enough, along the extreme edges and any sort of final curves where the light is likely to catch this green. So take your time here, go around the whole tank, and any machine guns or lamps and what have you, slow down a bit when you come to them, because I have knocked off more than my fair share of guns doing this dry brushing step. When you're doing that final dry brush, make sure to run the brush a couple of times over the wheels. Now what I have is flat brown, and I've watered this down a little bit more than I usually would, and we're just going to chuck this over the tracks. Go straight over any of the dirt and dust that you've popped on there, and you can water this down a little bit more than you normally might do. Any warm, slightly rusty sort of finished brown will work well here. So oak brown from the Army Painter is another winner. Don't worry if you can't get right up under the track sections without hitting anything, because we're just going to cover it over later. And then it's time to thin down a little bit of German grey, and we're going to paint over the black bits. So the machine gun, not a terrible huge amount of this to do, unless you've popped a whole bunch of tools or what have you on there. But steady hand as much as you can, and away we go. Up, steady hand, he says, come on. Gordon Bennett. Then get yourself a good old scrunkly brush, and a little bit of gunmetal from the Army Painter. Any dark metal is going to work just fine here. So you see, I don't bother painting the underside of my tanks because my tanks don't flip upside down when things go wrong. As a matter of fact, my tanks are invincible. They always do what Conrad Stalin says. So, over your tracks, just a quick dry brush of this, making sure to catch along the edges. Now at this point, if you've got any decals, apply them now before we get to our weathering stage. What I tend to like doing is just pop down a little bit of kitchen towel and go ahead and wet that directly. That way, these things will sit there waiting for you to pluck them off with your brush, and you don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to stay wet. I just realized I hadn't actually hit record for any of that. So what I have is a little bit of packing foam, see one of those little nodule sections, and some German camo black-brown. What I'm doing is just little random patches where, likely you're going to see some dinging from the environment, from incoming fire. It's very easy to go overboard with this quite quickly. So every now and then just hold it out at arm's length to see what you're leaving. Concentrate on edges and places where crew are likely to climb around. But you can add as much of this as you like. And this is the reason why we do our decals before doing our weathering. Because if you have a dinged up, worn turret and then nice shiny decals over the top, that looks a little weird. So I've mixed up now in my little well. This is 1 dot of red leather from Vallejo with 10 dots of the war paint stabilizer from the Army Painter, because we want this to be pretty thin. This is our rust finish. Now, in reality, even Soviet tanks were quite well cared for in the field. You wouldn't see them get massively rusty very quickly. So you want to be fairly sparing with this if you want to be realistic, air quotes there. However, we are painting this to look cool on a table, and considering our view distance, exaggerating some of these details a little bit makes them more visible at table length. So it is up to you how heavy you go with this stuff. Just paint a little bit of it into areas where you're likely to see thin bits of rust collecting, water dripping, or even over your chipping. You can just dab it fairly randomly and then poke it with your finger to get that to settle. And it's very subtle, but it will look cool. So like I said, don't go nuts with this, but a little bit of it will go quite a long way. So there's most of our tank done. Like I said, you want to stick quite subtle with the rust. Pop the turret off again, because the last thing we're going to do is to go back to that dirt and muck. So what I've mixed up, this is 1 part of flat earth to 2 parts of the war paint stabilizer. Now you can use water here, does not matter one bit. You want a fairly thin mix, because what we're going to do is, first of all, cover the muck that we've done, and you want to pop a little bit of this up and above where the mud has dried. So you're looking to kind of splatter the tank a little bit. And again, a scrunkly brush is the best option you've got here. There's no such thing as a brush worth throwing out. There's always a use for a gnarly old brush. So mind how you go when something looks like it's about ready to give up the ghost. What's happened is instead it's become your scrunkly brush. So get in under here as well. And don't matter if you're hitting the sides of the tank or the tracks or what have you. It's going to look more authentic by the time we're done. So once that has dried, we've got a little bit of visible muck and wear on our gunk. But what we want to do now is take some fresh flat earth, and this time with a slightly smaller brush, we're going to flick over those patches of junk. Now don't worry too much if you're not covering them completely, just enough to make it look a little bit more worn and lived in. So once I'm done with this, what I'm going to do is take them outside, hit them with a matte varnish spray, and I've got the Colourforge matte varnish for that today. Once I've done that, let's get a look at our T34 here when it is all finished. Whoops, I'm telling a lie. There is one last thing to do. I have Arctic Gem from the Army Painter, and any light blue here will do the job. I'm going to paint in the lamp pretty carefully. And then I'm going to pop a tiny wee bit of white, just a dot in each corner. Well, corner, each side of our little lamp here, to kind of give the impression of light shining through. Now, once I have matte varnished the entire tank, what I'm going to do is come back with a gloss varnish for that, and that's it. So now let's get a look at what it's going to look like when it's finished. And so there at last, our Soviet tank is complete. Now, I've chosen the T-34 here because it is pretty iconic, but this method will work for any Soviet armor that you'll like, even up to the big boppers like the KV-1. So it's nice and simple, doesn't use very many paints at all, and honestly, painting armor past a point is just comfort food. You know, getting out the foam and doing the chipping and stuff, it's meditative. It's a lot of fun. So I thoroughly recommend grab one of these if you've got a Soviet army coming. You're gonna need it. So as well, thanks goes to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, which includes my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time on and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.